October 28, 1942, London. On a gray morning when fog rolled low above the Thames, a column of uniforms appeared like a sudden tide along Whitehall, and the eyes of a tired Prime Minister widened. The sight was at once impossible and endless. American troops marching through the heart of the British capital, with helmets glinting and boots beating a cadence that seemed to shake cobbles and convictions. Winston Churchill stood at a window in Downing Street, the scent of pipe tobacco still in the room, and for a second his hand stilled on the heavy drapery. News had come in many forms that autumn, but nothing prepared him for the sound of foreign boots filling his city. That brief arrest of breath was a hinge. What followed would reveal how hope, pride, and strategic necessity could collide in a single street. This is the story of that moment, and why, when those columns passed the War Office and the Palace, a private feeling inside a public man altered the course of alliance and morale. He had written through the long nights a litany of cables and speeches. As Prime Minister, he had learned to measure words like artillery, to ration optimism like coal, to press his face to maps and imagine lines where there were none. Sir Winston had been shaped by childhood rooms heavy with books, by the rough voice of his father, and by a mother who read letters aloud in front of the fire. He had seen battles in other men's faces and tasted ash and tobacco in corridors of power. In schoolyards in his memory, the wind had smelled of chalk and wet grass. At Sandhurst, he had felt the leather of rains bite his palms. Later, as a young officer and reporter, he had slept in train compartments reeking of oil and peppery coffee. Those textures accumulated into a man who both loved ceremony and carried the private ache of responsibility. He had known victory and setback. He had learned to laugh at speeches that failed, and to light a cigar in moments when silence might have done more harm. The present, full of reports and telegrams, folded around that past and made each new arrival more than news. It became a test of whether accumulated habits of command could hold together with the fragile human hope that new allies might actually tip a scale long tilted toward despair. The Prime Minister's immediate circle had become a narrow theater. Clementine stood close by, her fingers pressed to a note she had written but not yet delivered, the ink still damp at one corner. Alan Brooke, raw-boned and exact, had come in from the War Office, his boots still carrying mud from the improvised trenches outside the city. Lord Halifax had sent a brief, precise telegram and then waited for analysis. From across the Atlantic came the names Dwight Eisenhower and George Marshall, voices on the wire whose syllables measured power and logistics. On the street, below, a young American lieutenant, James Miller, and a sergeant named Thomas Reed had marched with a company of men who had never seen Parliament Square, but who had practiced salutes in open fields and hangars. Margaret Thompson, a shopkeeper on Whitechapel Road, pressed her palms to the window of her bakery and watched, while Mayor William Clark went to the station to meet officers and offer civic words. For Churchill, the lineup of these names was both reassurance and a map of new obligations. Each brought a smell, a sound, and expectation: French mustard on a field ration, the damp wool of a foreign greatcoat, the metallic clink of gear, the laughter out of tune with local dialects. These were not abstractions. They were bodies that would demand billeting, rations, coordination, and the subtle labor of making strangers feel like allies. If you are feeling the same chill that comes when an old world meets a new force, you are not alone. Tell us in the comments which detail of this moment surprised you most. Was it the image of marching boots on London stones, the private pause of a leader, or the way ordinary citizens reacted? Start your comment with the phrase, "I was struck by," and finish in one sentence. Share this to help others think about how alliances change daily life, and to guide future episodes where we examine the unexpected human texture of wartime diplomacy. Your observations help shape which moments we explore next and bring voices to histories that sometimes sound only in official dispatches. Now let us return to that morning and follow the footsteps that echoed through the heart of a nation. The waiting had been both mechanical and intimate. Logistical cables described convoys and berthing, but letters described mites. In 3 short paragraphs of private history, the Prime Minister's life returned and explained the man who watched. First came childhood and early habits, a list of small rituals that anchored him in storms. He remembered the scratch of pen on paper in his father's drawing room, the taste of rusks at breakfast, and the particular echo of church bells on a clear October morning. Second came formation and the making of strategy in youth and middle years, when he learned to read maps by lamplight, to taste the dust of training grounds, to listen to the metallic orders of staff meetings. He had memorized the metallic flavor of rail oil, the rope burn from hurried signals, and the hush of committees that could decide the fate of thousands. Third came the present, a man who now walked rooms that smelled of ink and tobacco, whose hands sometimes trembled with exhaustion, and whose sleep was often interrupted by the clatter of new cables. These 3 paragraphs of memory, full of small senses, explained why the image of foreign boots in London could provoke a private tremor as much as a public calculation. The arrival itself read like a scene staged in an idealistic, old drama, but with real stakes. On the riverbank, banners and bunting flapped in a wet wind. Flags of the Union and stars hung awkwardly together, and crowds pressed to curbs, noses red with cold, trying to glimpse the faces of men who might change the weather of war. A battalion marched from the docks, columns neat as if rehearsed for a review. Yet their faces displayed fatigue, curiosity, and the raw hope of young soldiers who had not known the English sun. Sensory details piled. The metallic tang of sweat under woolen collars, the oily scent of motor engines idling in side streets, the murmur of 1,000 languages mixed into a London hum, the taste of vapor from breath turning to fog in mouths that once smelled of different seasons. Conversations broke out at curbs. A woman named Elsie Baker offered a loaf to a private named Miller, who tasted it and smiled, crumbs on his chin. Nearby, Harold Finch, a cab driver, wiped his hands and said in a voice that rasped of pipes and soot that he had never felt such noise in the city. The narrative moved from the macro to the micro, numbers, landings, and then a child's laugh bouncing off stone. The official registers were urgent and precise. Reports tallied divisions, shipping manifests, tonnage of supplies, the location of airfields, and the hours allocated for movement. The initial logistics were a puzzle: where to billet thousands, how to ensure rations without starving the home front, how to integrate training cycles between different doctrine in command. General Marshall's planning notes arrived with lists and acronyms. Eisenhower sent a calm message promising cooperation and asking for ports and fuel. Sir Alan Brooke answered with a line that read like an order and a plea at once. In the corridors of command, the air tasted of coffee and the faint iron of worry. Civil servants moved like clockwork, voices clipped, paper sliding, while the men in the streets smelled of foreign soap and gasoline. That day, the war room mapped avenues and warehouses, and the map itself took on the weight of expectation. Would the arrival of American brigades mean immediate relief at the front, or would it reconfigure supply chains and give rise to disputes about command? No plan removed the human element. Soldiers needed to sleep, to eat, to be seen with dignity by a capital that had been tested by blitz and ration. Tension mounted not only around logistics, but around identity and pride. In the first moment of friction, a local squabble erupted near a billet in Bloomsbury. A shopkeeper named Joseph Harrow protested that American prices were undercutting his business, and a captain named Lewis, whose voice carried the flat, sudden accent of the new forces, replied with a courtesy that masked impatience. Voices rose, then were softened by an older woman, Margaret, who stepped between them and offered tea. In this exchange contained memory and decision. The city had to decide whether assistance could be assimilated without losing its dignity. The smell of boiling water, the clank of porcelain, the texture of a sugar cube placed between two palms became a small ritual of negotiation. This was a moment that could have become a headline of resentment, but instead became a scene where civility and need found a temporary balance. Another tension surfaced when a rumor spread that American troops would assume authority over certain training grounds reserved for British units. Soldiers who had trained in those fields for years felt sidestepped. Private James Miller, tasked with relaying orders, remembered a letter from his brother about the smell of hay in their home county and felt suddenly that this foreign grass held weight. Officers argued in meetings, voices low and urgent. Personal memories of places, of rights, clashed with strategic imperative. One colonel wrote in his notes that accommodation was not only physical but symbolic. The decision that followed, negotiated in long meetings with maps spread on a table that smelled faintly of wax and pipe smoke, required both firmness and delicate diplomacy. It was a choice that weighed the short-term comfort of soldiers against the long-term cohesion of an alliance. At the center of these logistical and social frictions stood Churchill in a scene that would become the defining tableau of the day. The Prime Minister walked to the street himself, wrapped in a coat that smelled of his own pipe, his face lit by the low autumn sun. He encountered Eisenhower in a small square near the ministry. The dialogue that followed would be recorded and retold in fragments, but the essence was human and textured. Churchill spoke first, his voice rough but clear. "General, your men are in our streets. How will this change the fight?" Eisenhower replied, calm and direct, "Sir Winston, they are here to fight and to stand beside you. Our lines will be one front." Churchill answered, softer, "We have waited for boots we could trust, but trust is more than presence." Eisenhower leaned slightly, the smell of engine oil and cologne underlining the moment. "We understand, we will listen, and we will adapt." Then Brooke interjected, precise and pragmatic. "Command needs clarity. How will sectors be divided?" Eisenhower produced a map, fingers stained with ink. "We propose joint control for operations and separate administration for billets and supply for the short term." Churchill considered the map and the faces, the taste of tobacco filling his mouth, and then he said, in a voice that mixed statecraft and simple relief, "Then let us begin. We will carry the burden together." This exchange had 6 turns, each line like a step across a bridge of alliance. The sensory backdrop made it more than strategy. The clack of boots, the smell of leather, the chill on the air, the glint of wet metal, the fur of a hat scraped against a palm, the murmur of a crowd forming the score beneath the spoken. In the aftermath, the local reaction shifted between gratitude and grievance. In the marketplaces, women named names. Elsie Baker, who had shared a loaf, Harold Finch, who had driven men to quarters, Mrs. Porter, who had sheltered a wounded courier, Thomas Reed, who had written a letter home that would become a family relic, and a clerk named Arthur Langley, who coordinated supplies. Their small actions stitched together a picture of a city adapting. Politically, there were consequences. Supply allocations were revised, new convoys were scheduled, and joint committees formed to solve immediate frictions. Militarily, the arrival allowed planners to think in broader terms about an eventual push into continental Europe. The presence of American divisions altered estimations of force ratios and opened possibilities that had once been remote. Yet, the human story remained. Families hosting strangers, shopkeepers recalibrating prices, children naming new soldiers as if they were heroes in a play. 1 month on, the Prime Minister received letters that mixed thanks and caution. He visited a hospital wing where sailors and soldiers shared a ward, the antiseptic smell sharp against the cotton of bandages, and he noted the way men from different nations traded jokes and cigarettes. 3 months later, there were formal meetings in which command structures were refined, maps annotated, and a sense of joint purpose took firmer shape. 6 months after that morning, the joint planning bore fruit in operations that required synchronized coordination of air and sea and land. The simple image of boots on London stones had grown into corridors of cooperation, into convoys that crossed oceans, and into a political reality that made possible a larger offensive. In the end, the day when Churchill saw American troops march through London was not merely a spectacle. It was a pivot where private relief and public calculation met in a curbside salute. The moment taught that alliances are built by steps both large and small, by the clink of a mess kit shared between strangers, by the careful allocation of a warehouse, by a leader who could turn astonishment into a plan. It also taught that emotional reactions in public men matter. Churchill had carried weight, and in that pause at the window, something shifted. History measured consequences in operations and numbers, but memory recorded the smell of tobacco, the taste of bread, the sound of boots. If this story resonated with you, share your thought below and tell us which detail stayed with you. Join us next time as we follow another moment when personal feeling and geopolitical necessity collided on a city street.